For nearly 30 years, Volition stood tall and quietly held their own weight as one of the video game industry's most consistently inventive developers. From pioneering shooters with 6 degrees of freedom like Descent, to essentially revolutionizing things like environmental destruction with their Red Faction series, which then sorta led them to creating arguably one of gaming's most recognizable open-world franchises in Saints Row. The Chicago-based studio quickly garnered themselves quite the legacy due to how pretty much each and every one of their games is notable for having either a somewhat unique writing style, a fascinating amount of dedication to the technology behind the game itself, and/or an interesting art style in general. But unfortunately, that legacy would ultimately come to an abrupt conclusion in August of 2023, when Volition announced via LinkedIn of all places that the studio was closing its doors for good, as a part of Embracer Group's sweeping restructuring efforts following a failed $100 million deal with the Saudi-backed Savvy Games Group, bringing a seemingly random and definitive end to a once beloved studio whose influence stretched far beyond anyone working there ever probably actually imagined it could. But, as many of you may not know, before Volition would go on to become synonymous with the infamous purple fleur-de-lis and open-world sandboxes in general, they had already spent more than a decade quietly shaping the industry around them, and although they did so in minor ways by today's standards, these were not minor achievements at the time because they essentially inspired/showed other developers that the technology of your video game could serve the player just as well as any other system at play. But despite this being a recorded fact, I'm still a little reluctant to give the studio that much credit for quote-unquote revolutionizing the video game industry, because in reality, an argument can totally be made that everything Volition did was ultimately learned by their founders working at other studios beforehand. Which sort of segues me into the birth of Volition, but I'm gonna need you to pay attention for a second here because their origins as a studio are a bit more confusing than most others. You see, before Volition was a studio or even a thought in anybody's head, its founders, Mike Kulas and Matt Toshlong, were already co-workers at another studio called Sublogic, which itself is primarily known for its early 1990s flight simulators in case you were wondering, but I digress. According to reports, despite having only a few run-ins with each other, both men had extensive experience with 3D graphics and simulation software, and by April of 1993, the two had apparently already sketched out their own original game concept together and attempted to pitch it to Looking Glass Technologies that same year. But unfortunately, Looking Glass declined to publish the game because both Kulas and Toshlong wanted to retain the IP rights, keep full ownership of their game. So, rather than just abandoning the idea, the two decided they should start their own development company and pursue their idea together instead, which is exactly what they did. After the duo officially left their jobs, they wasted no time forming and founding the studio known as Parallax Software together in June of 1993 in Champaign, Illinois, with publishers like Interplay and Apogee providing early financial support to the tiny, freshly conceived studio, which allowed them to begin working on what would eventually become their breakout game, also known as Descent. And if you're a little confused because I said Parallax Software instead of Volition, just hang on and trust me for a second, I'm getting to that. In the following years, Parallax Software grew from just the two founders into a small studio of fewer than 10 people, and immediately after a staff was gathered, the team wasted no time working on their very first game, which would become Descent. Now, Descent is a little tricky to talk about because it technically has origins, or DNA I guess you could say, dating as far back as 1986, when Toshlong first joined the gaming industry at Sublogic, which is also where he first met Kulas, coincidentally enough. Eventually, though, Toshlong left Sublogic in 1988 and started working for Looking Glass Technologies, where he would work with an extremely talented guy by the name of Ned Lerner to develop a game called Car and Driver. And in case you didn't know, Ned Lerner was the founder of Lerner Research, which is a 3D simulation development company most notably responsible for their work on games like Chuck Yeager's Advanced Flight Trainer, Deep Space, Ultima Underworld, F-22 Interceptor, and he also created the very first 3D system ever licensed by Electronic Arts. But these are all topics worthy of their own video if I'm being honest. Kulas would also join Looking Glass sometime in 1990 as well to help develop the utilities for Car and Driver, which ultimately netted the two developers under the same roof yet again, seemingly by fate. Despite their fresh tenure at this new company though, Kulas and Toshlong had secretly devised an idea of an indoor flight simulator that utilized shaded polygons, because that was a really big deal in the gaming industry at the time in case you didn't know. But after working on Ultima Underworld, the duo realized they could add textures to the polygons of their game themselves for a spectacular effect. So, by April of 1993, the two had conceived a rough 2-page sketch for what would eventually become Descent, but upon pitching the idea to Looking Glass, they got rejected. And, well, you know the rest considering how I just went over it a few paragraphs ago in the intro. Even though the pair had left both Sublogic and Looking Glass in order to form their own studio, aka Parallax Software, sometime in 1993, it wouldn't be until December of 1994 before the official shareware version of Descent would debut to the public. And when the full game officially launched a few months later in March of 1995, it quickly became one of PC gaming's biggest technical showcases. Mainly because Descent featured things like a fully explorable 3D environments, dynamic lighting, somewhat of a sophisticated multiplayer system, and a technology well ahead of most shooters of the era. And I know most of these things are basically an industry standard for modern developers and don't really seem that impressive all these years later, but you have to keep in mind that all of this was accomplished in the mid-90s. Descent was also notable for using a custom 3D cuboid engine based on what Toshlong describes as a portals, which Toshlong himself reflected on in a Planet Descent interview from August of 2000. Quote, "I wrote the portal engine because it was the best idea I had for creating a large level while rendering as little of it as possible. I came up with the idea at Looking Glass when Doug Church was explaining how the engine worked in Ultima Underworld." End quote. And in case you didn't know, that game is the pioneer of texture mapping, but that's besides the point, I suppose. Long story short, every few months seemed to bring a new breakthrough of sorts, and from what I understand, I get the idea that there was a genuine sense that no one yet knew what the future of interactive entertainment actually looked like. Hell, earlier that same year, id Software released Doom, and that game clearly demonstrated just how transformative three-dimensional spaces could be for the medium of gaming in general, and had everyone and their actual mothers talking about it in one shape or another on somewhat of a regular basis. And although its environments were technically a clever illusion rather than an actual fully explorable 3D environment, id Software's landmark shooter still fundamentally changed every player's subconscious expectation of what a video game could entail now, practically giving birth to the first-person shooter as we know it as well. Fast-paced movement, immersive worlds, networked multiplayer, and an unprecedented level of technical sophistication not only went on to define what the FPS genre would go on to chase for the next decade and beyond, but it also made it very clear to everyone on the outside that computer games were entering a new era thanks to the recent and steady advancement of technology. For smaller, independent studios, this technological race sort of leveled the playing field to an extent, because now success was no longer measured solely by the size of a company or by its immense marketing budget. Meaning, in theory, a talented team of programmers and developers with an innovative idea could stand alongside much larger competitors by either creating new technology, solving difficult engineering problems, by reimagining how players interacted with virtual worlds themselves, and/or just by simply working smarter. Or, in other words, over time and as the 90s continued to progress, it was becoming more and more clear to everyone that technological innovation in itself had become one of the industry's most valuable currencies, which is probably why Descent flourished so well in this environment if I had to guess, honestly. I know it's not much, but that's my 2 cents on the matter anyway. And although the sales data for the game is currently unavailable, it's pretty safe to assume this game was a commercial success considering how it's still kind of talked about today, and since, you know, it kind of firmly established Parallax Software as one of the industry's most talented technology-centered development studios and all. Following the success of Descent, though, the founders of Parallax, Matt Toshlong and Mike Kules, also found that the two were steadily wishing for different things as they and their company continued to grow. Apparently, as Wikipedia articles suggest, the two founders got into a verbal disagreement of sorts sometime in 1995 when Toshlong wanted to move the studio out of Illinois and over to Michigan for some reason, with Kulas rejecting the idea because he preferred living in Illinois. So, in an attempt to settle the dispute, Parallax Software tried to operate from 2 separate offices at the same time, with Mike Kulas deciding to continue working at the one remaining in Champaign, Illinois, and Matt Toshlong relocating to the new one opening in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And although this seemed to solve the relocation issue the studio was facing, it also introduced a much bigger one. As the two would quickly come to find out, managing one team across 2 offices separated by hundreds of miles proved in itself to be just as difficult as it was inefficient. And as another side note, I know video game developers having multiple studios across the globe working simultaneously under the same umbrella isn't that special of a thing as far as today's era of video game development is concerned. But again, try to remember that this was in the middle of the 90s, and not only was this idea still seen as somewhat of a gamble in general, but communication didn't travel as fast as it does today either. Thankfully, none of this internal conflict, for lack of a better term, had much if any effect on Descent 2 itself. And for that small percentage of you that are actually curious, the game itself was pretty fun, but it's basically a carbon copy of its predecessor if I'm being totally honest with you. I mean, take that criticism with a grain of salt, of course, because I didn't actually beat any of the games, but if you were to play them both back-to-back in quick succession like I did while gathering footage for this video, I highly doubt you'll be able to spot any major differences off rip. Unfortunately, even though the team was able to develop an entirely new game in the franchise, Parallax still eventually came to the conclusion that maintaining a steady stream of information and/or communication in general between the two somewhat isolated studios was becoming increasingly difficult to actually maintain, and harder to justify as the days went on, which is ultimately what led to each office gradually developing its own identity at the cost of Parallax itself. And if you're a little confused by what I mean when I say that, allow me to explain. You see, by late 1996, it had become abundantly clear to Kulaz and Toshlong that Parallax Software's two-office structure wouldn't be a sustainable business practice forever. And rather than pointlessly fighting over leadership roles or forcing one office's staff into relocating somewhere they didn't want to be, the duo decided an amicable split was the best decision for all parties involved. And I suppose I should also mention that this decision wasn't necessarily caused by financial trouble or creative disagreements, although that's what most reports online seem to hint at. From what I can understand, it was simply just the most practical solution the two studios could come to that benefited everyone involved equally, even if that decision was technically the final nail in the coffin for Parallax Software too, albeit unintentionally. But before you go feeling all sad or feel bad about Parallax's closure, don't. Because believe it or not, this isn't actually as bad as it sounds. You see, after the closure of Parallax Software, Mike Kulaz officially established Volition as a company in November of 1996 in Champaign, Illinois, inheriting the same Illinois office that the studio previously used under the name Parallax Software as well. And in case you are wondering what happened to the studio's staff, most of the same programmers, artists, designers, and even the support staff who had been working under Parallax continued working together and living their lives as usual, just under a new company name now. Which is why I said you shouldn't feel bad about Parallax's shutdown earlier, because most, if not all, of the same employees never actually lost their jobs, or were they actually affected by this in any significant or financial way. I mean, from a practical standpoint, very little actually changed overnight. The office itself remained in the same spot it always was, meaning many of the same employees continued working together without even having to do the smallest of adjustments like changing their route to work, and the team's technical expertise carried over fully intact as well, which is something that can't really be said about most corporate restructures. And even though technically speaking, Volition was a newly established company on paper, it still had a publishing deal with Interplay that carried over from Parallax Software signing it in 1994. But don't worry, because that didn't stop Volition from establishing their own culture as a studio at all, and more importantly, it allowed them to work on something other than the Descent franchise. And another side note, I always thought the name Volition itself was such a great name for the studio/company because it essentially describes the mentality/philosophy of everything the studio had hoped to embody, and there's also a fun little origin story attached to it as well. As the legend goes, when the deadline to register a new name for the company arrived, Kulaz apparently disliked and rejected all 50 submitted names by his employees, which led him to begin pulling reference books and dictionaries off of his living room shelf in an attempt to find inspiration, which is where he ultimately chose the name Volition after reading its definition in a dictionary, which is an intense, active will to accomplish something, for those of you who are curious. Kulaz felt this phrase perfectly mirrored the high-effort, collaborative nature of team-driven software development, and in my opinion, it's a pretty fitting name for a company born from the decision to forge its own path in the video game industry.
So we were Parallax and we were splitting in half and we needed a new name. There was really no sense of urgency to it, so I just said, hey, we're going to come up with a new name, send in your ideas. And I kind of forgot about the whole thing. And then I thought, oh my God, I have to file papers finally. It's like we agreed, Matt and I, we're going to split legally on this date. Well, that means certain things need to happen. One of those is you write your name down on a piece of paper and you file that with the state. So I didn't like any of the names that people had submitted. So I remember where I was in my living room pulling books off the shelf, looking in, first like a dictionary and just random pages, and a thesaurus and looking up things. And then reference books and looking in the glossaries in the back and just hoping something would jump out, combining words and so forth. And I remember doing that. I don't remember what book it was, but I remember I found volition in the glossary. It's not a complex word, but it was in the glossary, and it said like an intense active will to accomplish something. And I thought, oh, it's probably, I just like, whatever makes sense now, I want to go to sleep. But I thought, okay, that's what software is, right? It's really almost nothing. It's just a bunch of electrons. Now it's 100 people working for several years, working very hard at this nebulous thing, really just realizing ideas, and then now distributing it as electrons, right? I mean, what could be more ethereal than that? So it's really just, it's the act of will that is creating something, so you have this volition to do something. That was good enough, write it on the sheet of paper and be done with it. So, the name has grown on me. I like Parallax software. Turns out there were like 3 or 4 of them. But Volition, that's where it came from. It sort of makes sense. And it was more, we need a name. Let's get that name and move on to other things.
Meanwhile, all that was happening, though, Tosh Long took control over the other office in Michigan, and eventually reorganized it into a company called Outrage Entertainment. And much like Volition, Outrage wasn't starting from scratch either, so to speak. They'd also essentially inherited anyone who didn't end up working at Volition after Parallax's split, with the only actual differences between these two studios being that Outrage Entertainment would continue working closely with Interplay and remaining a lot more directly connected to the Descent franchise, eventually going on to develop Descent 3 all on their own, which would go on to be released sometime in 1999 before the dawn of the new millennium. While Volition, on the other hand, chose to branch out and explore new genres and technologies alike. So, long story short, the split of Parallax Software had effectively given birth to 2 new studios, with each one of them carrying forward different aspects of Parallax legacy. And I guess it should also be stated that just because the development responsibilities had been divided between Volition and Outrage, that doesn't mean that Parallax Software itself had just disappeared overnight like how I made it sound earlier. If you want to be a Redditor about it, the company still technically continued to exist for a short period of time, but only in the form of a legal corporate entity, primarily to manage existing business obligations, IP rights, contracts, royalties, and/or any other copyright ownership rights connected to projects that may be in development or have been developed before the split. This is a fairly common practice during corporate reorganizations, mind you, as dissolving a company immediately can complicate ongoing legal and financial responsibilities that company may have. Like the studio's publishing deal with Interplay, for example. Eventually, though, after those obligations were either transferred or concluded, Parallax Software quietly ceased operations altogether and officially faded out of existence by the end of 1997. Albeit by then, it's totally arguable that the studio's legacy was still being carried forward by its 2 successor studios, but I guess I'll leave that argument for the comment section. And for those of you wondering why I've decided to dedicate so much of this video's runtime to explaining this seemingly trivial sequence of events, I mainly did it because I wanted to make sure I got the story clear that Volition emerged directly from the closure of Parallax Software, because it's pretty common to see people online talk about Volition as having been formed in 1993. And although there is definitely some bit of merit to that statement, albeit a fraction, it is essentially the YouTube Shorts version of that story, to put it lightly. While yes, it is true that the team that eventually became Volition had been working together with each other since 1993, they did so under the roof of Parallax Software originally, and many of those skills, philosophies, and technical foundations that would later go on to define Volition in one way or another in the near and ever-approaching future were firmly established here during these early years inside of a studio that no longer exists, and has for the most part been forgotten by time. And that's why I felt like I should start the video this way. Following the split from Parallax Software, though, Volition entered 1997 with something they had never truly possessed since Parallax's original debut back in 1993, which was a blank slate. Although many of the same developers who had created Descent were still working together in Illinois, the studio was no longer forced to define itself by that series alone, thanks to Tosh Long and the other fellows at Outrage Entertainment picking up the torch and continuing work on Descent 3 all by themselves. This meant that Volition was essentially free to ask themselves a much broader question. What kind of developer did they actually want to become anyway? And unfortunately for them, the answer to that question wasn't immediately obvious. In hindsight, the easiest decision might have been to continue making first-person shooters or to simply revisit the ideas that had already made the company successful in the past, but instead, Volition deliberately moved their pawn in an entirely different direction. And as ironic as this sounds now, thanks to things like hindsight, the studio wanted to prove that its greatest strength wasn't a particular game or franchise, but rather it was the people and technology behind the games themselves. And that willingness to step into unfamiliar territory would inevitably become one of Volition's most defining characteristics over the next 2 decades. Technically speaking, Volition's first project as an independent company was Descent: Free Space: The Great War, which released in 1998. And despite still brandishing the Descent name for marketing purposes, the game is almost entirely unrelated to its predecessor in every way that it could be. Rather than navigating through narrow mining tunnels this time around, players took control over huge starfighters in the middle of a sprawling interstellar war, complete with massive capital ships, coordinated fleet battles, and a story written and told on a scale far beyond anything else the studio has ever dared to attempt before. I think it's pretty safe to say that for Volition, Free Space was a statement of intent. The studio obviously wasn't interested in repeating past successes simply because they were familiar. They wanted to challenge themselves creatively and technically, using the experience they gained from Descent as a sort of a fuel for that creative engine. And the result of all that creative energy channeled into this was one of the video game industry's most ambitious space combat simulators of its era, which quickly earned widespread critical acclaim for its intelligent AI, unique mission design, thought-provoking atmosphere, and overall cinematic presentation. Free Space was also the very first project that forced Volition to grow as an organization as well. During the game's development, the studio nearly tripled in size, going from just a team of 8 workers to a team of 20 by the time the game was ready to ship. With Kulaz, who had spent many of his early years writing engine code alongside with the rest of the team, gradually started to shift into the role of studio president. He reportedly found more and more of his time was being consumed by things like hiring staff members, managing the team's budgets, coordinating projects in general, and steering the company towards their long-term destination. And even though Kulaz wasn't able to be as hands-on with his team as he was before, this was still a net positive for Volition in the long run.
The team about doubled in size, and then I was spending more time running the company. So I was spending about half my time programming, half my time running the company, and that became a problem, right? You know, sometimes if there's a business issue that has to be dealt with, if there's a contract or something like that that has to be negotiated, and I'm in the middle of a critical system lost, and other guys are kind of stuck because the president of the company is not getting his stuff done. So that was a little bit of a challenge, and after Free Space, I did a little bit of programming after that, but that was the last game that I really did any significant amount of programming on.
Following the success of Free Space, though, Volition quickly began working on its sequel, Free Space 2, and would go on to release that game the following year in 1999. The sequel refined pretty much every aspect of the original, featuring larger battles, improved AI, expanded mission scripting, and even a more mature narrative. Critics also praised it extensively, and in the years since, it has seemingly come to be regarded as one of the greatest space combat games ever made, achieving a cult classic-like level of status among a select few. Commercially, however, is a bit of a different story altogether because, believe it or not, the game actually struggled to find an audience, which probably isn't that hard to believe because by the end of the 1990s, interest in the space simulation genre had begun to decline as players were gravitating more towards first-person shooters and other notable emerging console experiences of the millennium. While this was surely disappointing at the time, I'm sure its reception, or lack thereof, also taught Volition an important lesson. Even exceptional games weren't immune to changing market trends. If the studio wanted to continue to grow and actually grow, it would need to keep evolving alongside the industry and not become complacent. And by the tail end of the 1990s, Volition had found themselves at another sort of crossroads. You see, although Free Space 2 had earned a few good reviews, it still failed to achieve the same amount of commercial success as its predecessor and that the studio was counting on. And with Descent 4 ultimately getting cancelled halfway through development because of how Interplay struggled to fund the project due to the company's own mounting financial difficulties finally catching up to them, this meant that Volition's future has quite literally never looked as dark and or bleaker than it did at the end of 1999. So, just to put that all into perspective again, Volition had watched one of their newly created franchise practically fail to keep its audience entertained, and another company, which just so happened to be playing a key role by supporting them financially, just disappeared from the face of the earth altogether. For many independent studios, setbacks of this magnitude could be devastating and or the final nail in the coffin for their endeavors if they aren't able to bounce back quickly enough. But Volition, however, viewed them less as dead ends and more as an opportunity to rethink their strategy going forward. Rather than doubling down on the familiar paths that led them to where they are today, the team began asking themselves another question that would essentially come to quietly define the company's identity for the next few years to come. Which was, what can we build that no one else is currently building? It was a design philosophy rooted in experimentation, I'll give them that. And for what it's worth, it did kind of totally save the studio's ass in this specific scenario. I mean, what can you say? Credit where credit's due. And in case you happen to be bummed out about the news of Descent 4 being cancelled, don't worry because Volition made sure that years of hard work wouldn't be wasted by turning the scrapped game into a new one altogether. Believe it or not, the engine, design ideas, and technical innovations developed during its production were carefully reworked into an entirely original project, with this new project eventually becoming a game called Red Faction, although it wouldn't get released for another few years, mind you. And the interesting thing about Red Faction is that rather than competing with other first-person shooters on gunplay alone, Volition decided to build the game around its groundbreaking geomod technology, which allowed players to blast tunnels through rock, collapse sections of the environment, and to solve problems in ways that simply weren't possible in most other shooters of the era, and even of today's era, all things considered. At the same time of Red Faction's development, though, another team within Volition was working on a game called Summoner, which would go on to be a fantasy role-playing game designated to be released as one of the PlayStation 2's earliest launch titles. And the contrast between the two projects is incredibly striking, to say the least. As one game explores things like authoritarianism through the lens of science fiction and technical innovation, while the other tends to focus on things like fantasy worlds and character-driven storytelling. When put together, though, they make it very clear that Volition had little interest in becoming known as a studio popular for one singular genre or franchise. And even though that's eventually what happened, that's besides the point. I'm talking about how they felt in the Y2K era, and in case you didn't know, people tended to think some crazy things around this time period.
With about 3 months left to go, Interplay asked us to pull it in a month. I think they had just recently gone public and they were very focused on their quarters. It's like, we need a game in this quarter, can you pull it in? So we pulled it in. I thought the game was very good. It was nominated, had a couple nominations for Game of the Year. I think it's our highest rated game ever. The hardcore fans still look back at it and we still get the emails, when are you going to do Free Space 3 and so forth. I think pulling it in actually hurt the sales of the game. They didn't adjust their marketing plan as far as I could tell. Back then I think I just believed great games will of course sell themselves. Not true then, certainly not true now.
I guess for lack of a better word, it was almost a hubris. That the belief that we can do anything. We can tackle any genre we want, and whatever kind of game we're interested in making, we can make.
Gamers didn't necessarily have joysticks anymore. The big genres then were, I would say, RTS and FPS. Those are mouse keyboard games. So you had a lot of gamers who just didn't own a joystick, and we supported mouse, as an input for Free Space and Free Space 2, but it wasn't very playable that way. So I think, I thought we really executed well on that game, and in some ways just kind of some bad luck.
And maybe the genres come and go.
By the summer of 2000, though, the video game industry was on the verge of an entirely new console generation, with Sega's Dreamcast having already been released in North America the year prior, which in itself had kickstarted the sixth generation of gaming, and with Sony's PlayStation 2 only months away. Both Microsoft and Nintendo were rushing as fast as they could to enter the next phase of the console market as well. But publishers, on the other hand, were searching for studios capable of producing technically ambitious games that could showcase the raw power of all the new hardware available, so they could make a long-term investment or two. And coming into the 2000s, Volition had quietly but surely become one of the most technically talented and respected independent studios in the video game industry through their years of hard work in the 90s. Which is ultimately what led to THQ officially acquiring Volition in August of 2000, just months before the official releases of both Red Faction and Summoner. And even though both games were already deep into development way before the acquisition was even thought of, the deal itself still ensured that their employees' future, and the future of the studio itself, would no longer be plagued by short-term publishing agreements and/or financial uncertainty. So it was a little hard to just say no to all that. For Volition, with the unexpected collapse of their publishing deal with Interplay, the timing of this deal couldn't have been better in their eyes. The studio had spent the previous several years navigating through cancelled projects, changing market trends, and the constant challenge of funding technically ambitious games in general, which I've never personally done so, but I can't imagine is an easy or cheap task. So, to them, partnering up with THQ here was actually a good thing because it provided the studio with a level of financial security that very few independent studios actually enjoyed around this time, which also allowed the team to think beyond simply finishing its current project and instead allowed them the privilege to begin planning for the next project, and the next, and the next, and so on and so forth. You get the idea. Oh, and another thing I feel like should be highlighted. Unlike many other accounts of corporate acquisitions in the video game industry around this time, THQ largely allowed Volition to retain its culture and creative independence without forcing them to do anything outrageous like relocate, nor did they revise anyone already on payroll. Which was sort of unheard of around this time, believe it or not. I mean, the very first thing that came to my mind when I read this was whenever Microsoft acquired the Chicago-based studio known as Bungie in June of 2000, and then immediately ordered them to move their studio over 2,000 miles in order to be closer to Microsoft's headquarters/campus in Redmond, Washington. And mind you, Microsoft asked them to do this in the middle of the development of Halo Combat Evolved. So, as if developing the game on its own wasn't enough stress on the developers, they were quite literally asked to uproot their lives as well. Which thankfully didn't really go on to impact the outcome of that game all that much, but it did however result in a significant amount of the studio denouncing their tenure and or choosing to work for another company altogether. One of which was the studio's co-founder Alexander Serapin, because for him and many others who worked in the studio, Microsoft represented the exact opposite of Bungie's independent, counterculture identity the studio had spent so many of its early years carefully curating. Like I said though, thankfully Volition didn't have to deal with anything like this, and were actually allowed to flourish in ways the studio had never even considered before.
Summoner came out with the launch of the PlayStation 2 in October of 2000, I guess that would have been. On August 31st of 2000, we were acquired by, or merged in the legal sense, technically it was a merger, by THQ.
Our multi-project deal with Interplay was kind of winding down, and we needed another publisher for the role-playing game. Interplay had enough role-playing stuff going on. We were shopping it around, and THQ really loved it, and they flew out here and they told us how much they liked what they saw, and we showed them some more, and things just kind of progressed from there.
Yeah, eventually there were discussions on, hey, we'd like to have you as our own in-house developer. So yeah, that was it's interesting looking back. Like it meant changes. It was like, wow, okay, what is this going to mean? Are we still going to have kind of the creative freedom that we've enjoyed so far, or how much of our work are they going to dictate to us at this point?
I didn't really realize it at the time, but or I just thought it was normal. I woke up and I'd be taking a shower, thinking about what am I going to do today, and it's like, I don't know, should I bring the checkbook to work? My personal checkbook to work. Even with the successes we had with the increasing budgets and the increasing development cycles, it was easy to, it was the profits you made on the last game could easily be plowed into overages on the next game.
Fortunately, we've still enjoyed plenty of creative freedom. So from that aspect, it's been fantastic, and being owned by a publisher that is strong enough to just keep us going even when we have ridiculously long development cycles is pretty cool too.
I viewed it as very good news for the company. I thought I'm spending too much time worrying about money and all this, signed a deal for this project and then 2 months later wondering where's the deal for the next project. Too much preparing of demos. I thought all this stuff is going to go away. No, actually the number of demos goes up. It actually, a lot of the stuff I thought would go away did not go away, but I was a little worried how the company would react to it, and we were supposed to submit Summoner to Sony 3 weeks after, the merger. For all the employees, excluding me and maybe our office manager, life didn't really change. And one guy was on his honeymoon the date it took effect and I announced it, and we said, don't tell him. He won't notice that we're part of THQ unless he looks at his paycheck.
In a way, the release of Summoner and Red Faction marked the beginning of a brand new era for Volition, perhaps the dawn of the Golden Age, if you will. And with the actual hardware itself behind each and every game/console advancing and becoming exponentially more powerful by the year, this gave developers opportunities to create larger worlds, more sophisticated physics systems and engines, richer AI, and increasingly cinematic experiences. And I know that's sort of a given as the industry continues to progress and grow and all, but the main reason I even mentioned all these facts is because they benefit nobody better than Volition. Even under new financial structure, the studio continued to experiment with different kinds of games, all while refining the technologies behind them in as many ways as possible, meaning every project the studio worked on served as another opportunity to explore how players could interact with game worlds themselves in all new and meaningful ways. And in no game is this philosophy more present than it is in the very first Red Faction game. Red Faction also gave Volition something the studio had been desperately searching for since the Descent days, which was a successful original intellectual property capable of growing into a long-term franchise, perhaps even one the studio could milk for a few decades. Released in May of 2001, Red Faction managed to stand apart from other first-person shooters of its era mainly because of its unique geomod technology, which is essentially a fancy name for a dedicated system of mechanics that allowed players to carve tunnels through rocks, like I previously touched on before, blow their way through seemingly solid walls, and overall approach combat encounters in ways very few other games had the ability to replicate. While the feature wasn't utilized throughout each and every level in the game, it still showcased that environmental interaction could become far more than a visual or in-engine effect. It could actually become a strong pillar of the gameplay itself if utilized correctly. With franchises like Battlefield even going on to prove this very point again a few years down the line with their signature Levolution mechanics, but I digress. Fortunately for Volition though, Red Faction was both a critical and commercial success, with the game selling over 1 million copies and quickly becoming one of THQ's most valuable properties. And Summoner would also go on to share a similar fate, and was released later that same year in October of 2001. With that game going on to show audiences and the industry alike that Volition was a studio capable of existing outside of the shooter genre. As one of the PlayStation 2's earliest role-playing games, Summoner introduces players to a sprawling fantasy world built around exploration, turn-based combat, and concepts like narrative choice. And I gotta say, for what it's worth, the game is incredibly atmospheric, has a very appealing/soothing color palette, and was generally a lot more fun than I was expecting it to be before having played it. And although it never really achieved the same kind of commercial prominence or overarching legacy as Red Faction, it still performed well enough to earn itself a sequel the following year in September of 2002, just 1 month before I was actually born. Following the success of Red Faction and the Summoner franchise, though, Volition entered another period of steady expansion in terms of their company's roster anyway. Behind the scenes, the studio's continued success allowed them to hire yet another set of talented programmers, artists, writers, designers, animators, and producers, which officially transformed what had once been a relatively small independent developer into one of THQ's largest internal studios. And I know the studio technically outgrew the label of small studio a long time ago at this point, but I'm really just trying to use that as a reference point to show or signal home just how far the studio has actually come. Because now they were officially in the big leagues, competing for shelf space with titans like BioWare, Valve, and Rockstar Games on the daily. Another thing I feel like's just as important to bring up was the trust that Volition had earned within THQ, with each successful release of theirs strengthening the publisher's confidence in the studio, which eventually led to them giving the studio greater freedom to pursue original ideas rather than relying on licensed properties or what's already been established by them. And very few developers within THQ's belt were actually allowed to have that level of creative autonomy, believe it or not. But Volition consistently rewarded that trust by delivering technically ambitious games that helped diversify their publisher's portfolio time after time.
You know, a lot of the growing pains that we had initially were the consequence of not having, you know, people dedicated to making sure that everything is running smoothly. Once we hit the 30, 40 people mark in our team sizes, that's when we really needed that oversight.
I came here in 2003. Mike was kind enough to let me have my way. So I basically put in a brand new structure, because when I got here there was no structure. It was basically flat across the board. There was Mike, and then there was the lead, and it was art lead and a programming lead, and that was it. And so we wanted to grow, but where we sit in the country, we don't have a giant pool of people who understand how to make games.
With Red Faction establishing itself as a commercial success, it probably goes without saying that a sequel will quickly enter development. Also released in 2002, Red Faction 2 was Volition's first opportunity to build upon a proven franchise rather than create one from scratch, which was an opportunity the company/studio hasn't really had since the Free Space days, if you're keeping track of trivial shit like that, of course. The sequel itself, though, sort of shifted away from the oppressive mining colonies of Mars that were the center stage of the first game, and instead it chooses to focus on a more near-future version of Earth that's been ransacked by political corruption and civil war. The geomod tech also makes a return, though this time in a much more constrained form, all things considered, but that's neither here nor there, really. Although Red Faction 2 received generally positive reviews and performed well enough commercially, it also came as a surprise to some because Volition rarely ever made the same game twice, aside from the first few Descent games, of course. Most of their sequels typically sought their own identity, even when that meant moving away from the elements that had been defined in the previous entry. And while some fans of the series are reportedly missed the atmosphere and slower pacing of the original, the change itself is nothing if not a reflection of the broader trends within the shooting genre slowly but steadily changing. Keep in mind that by the time of 2002, gamers had seen enough corridors in their shooting games. With that being said, though, I highly doubt anyone was expecting the next game Volition released, which was a 2005's The Punisher, based off the Marvel comic book character / 2004 live-action film starring Thomas Jane of the same name. And at first glance, although adapting a Marvel comic book license may have seemed like an unusual direction for a studio primarily known for their unique take on science fiction, Volition still approached the project with the same amount of care they bestowed upon each and every other one of the games they've made. They identified what made the source material unique, and then built the game's mechanics around that identity. Instead of creating another straightforward third-person shooter, the developers at Volition thought about how the player would engage with the environments themselves, and then designed brutal executions and semi-destructible surroundings that reinforced Frank Castle's relentless methods. Like the game's infamous interrogation system, for example, which allowed players to exploit their environment in creative ways, all while the mature tone of things remained remarkably faithful to the character's darker comic book origins. Despite a bunch of controversy surrounding the game at its launch due to its cavalier depiction of violence, which in return caused the developers to make a number of post-production edits in order to avoid an adults-only rating, The Punisher was still able to take home mostly positive reviews, with critics frequently highlighting its satisfying combat system and commitment to the source material. The Punisher was also THQ and Volition's first majorly successful licensed property, and to be fair, most licensed games of the time often suffered from rushed development schedules and/or conservative design, existing primarily to capitalize on the popularity of the existing brand more than to be an actual video game. But Volition approached this project completely differently from all the other companies. Even if the game is doing its best Max Payne impression at times, apart from the bullet time mechanic of course, it was still a load of fun, and it still is all these years later, all things considered. More importantly, though, the game clearly demonstrated Volition's growing confidence as a studio. Whether developing an original franchise or adapting an already established license, the team consistently looked beyond genre conventions in search of mechanics that expressed the identity of the game itself. And although this approach greatly benefited the Punisher game specifically, it wasn't a secret formula the studio could rinse and repeat like a real-life infinite money glitch or anything like that. You see, as the Xbox 360 approached in 2005, the industry began to shift once again.
Hello, this is Michael Cera from Arrested Development, and happy birthday, Microsoft. You're so big now and cute.
By the time of 2005, the video game industry was preparing for yet another technological leap. Microsoft's Xbox 360 was set to launch that November, which upon arrival would officially usher into the 7th generation of consoles, which themselves were equipped with dramatically more sophisticated and powerful hardware, expanded memory options, and a growing emphasis on online connectivity. In other words, now developers suddenly had those tools to build those larger worlds everyone was wanting, and the power to develop increasingly seamless experiences that would have been impossible only a few years earlier. And Volition recognized that change early, or earlier than most, I guess. To be fair, though, the studio had already spent years experimenting with player freedom and open-ended level design, so in theory, I guess it isn't all that impossible for one to assume that with a whole new generation of hardware on the horizon and the infrastructure of THQ behind them, that those ideas were about to be amplified and/or held to a much higher degree. Before I can begin addressing the elephant in the room, though, I have to talk about the events that led to birthing said elephant, if you will. And I think a pretty good starting point for this specific section is the dawn of the millennium. You see, in 2001, when Grand Theft Auto 3 was released, it had more or less fundamentally changed everyone's expectations for what an open-world action-adventure game could actually be. Rather than guiding players through a series of disconnected levels and eventually offering them a half-assed climax of some kind, Rockstar gave players Liberty City, which essentially functioned as a living environment that encouraged players to explore, experiment, and goof off in any and every way they could, followed by Vice City and San Andreas pushing that formula even further a few years later. Safe to say, the impact these games had on the industry and the world at large is incredibly hard to describe with a limited word count to say the least. And when I say limited word count, I mean that this video is already 5,000 words over what I projected it to be, and it doesn't need to get any longer. Afterwards, nearly every major publisher began looking for its own answer to Rockstar's success, and just like that, open-world games rapidly became one of the most desired genres in development, with studios across the industry experimenting with persistent cities, freeform mission structures, and sandbox gameplay designs till their heart's content. And despite how it probably made that sound, this really wasn't all that of a bad thing, because without this open-world boom, if you will, we would have never got titles like the True Crime series, Driver, the Godfather game, the Scarface game, and numerous other honorable mentions I'm sure I'm blanking on right now. This is also where the phrase GTA clone started to gain some traction online, as it was, and still is I suppose, often used to dismiss these kind of games as imitators or as mere off-brand knockoffs of the ever-so-wholly original product that is GTA. As if GTA can do no wrong or is immune to criticism for whatever reason, but that's beside the point. And while many of these projects undeniably do borrow a thing or two from Rockstar's blueprint, I still feel like the term overlooks an important fact of the matter, which is that the industry wasn't merely chasing Grand Theft Auto's setting or subject matter. The industry was more so chasing the sense of freedom that players had come to expect in every other game after they'd finished playing Grand Theft Auto 3 for the first time.
I had this design exercise, this was one of the first times we'd done it at the studio. We invited everyone to participate in coming up with new game ideas.
One of the ideas was this gang simulator. First-person shooter, gang simulator, real straightforward, nasty little game. And we were talking about it, and to me the idea of doing that didn't make sense, but what made sense to me was to go where the audience was, but there wasn't a lot of competitors. And for us, that was open world. There was nobody doing those games, it was just basically GTA. And my attitude was, there's 8 million people playing those games, no one's been able to succeed, we're a very high-tech group, why don't we take a shot at this, and instead of trying to do all kinds of different things like role-playing games and first-person shooters and all this sort of stuff, why don't we just try and focus all of our skills into one area, which would be open world.
So we cobbled together this vision trailer by taking clips from movies and clips from other games and cut it to a hip-hop song name I can't remember, the song I can't remember, but yeah, it was Fuck the Police, that was it. And we played that in the boardroom. And there was dead silence afterwards, and the CFO says, is this really the kind of game that we want to be making? And they talked about, we're near LA, gangs are a serious matter here, we have gang fights, we have gang riots, we have a lot of people being killed. Brian Farrell, the CEO, said, someone's going to make games like this, I believe in this, and we're going to make this game. And then we came up with rules like, there will be no children, you can't kill the police, which that rule fell away. And I forget what a lot of the other ones were. It was, people were very nervous about what we were doing there. I think some of them were probably worried, someone's going to throw bricks through my window or something like that.
It was an interesting struggle. There were people who were not happy with what we were making there. I mean, on the team, did not want to make that game, did not want to even be associated with that game.
It was called Bling Bling at the time. That was the name of the concept, and it was back when the term was, I don't know, I can't say cool, but like new.
It was really more of a gang simulator. It was a more serious game, but to me the sort of wacky humor aspects of Saints Row, for me, I hope for a lot of people, take away a lot of the, oh my God, you're a gangbanger doing these terrible things. You give player tools like driving vehicles and explosives and so forth, and a somewhat real city to do it in, they're gonna do wacky stuff.
Unlike many studios entering the open world space for the first time, though, Volition wasn't starting from scratch per se. Throughout the early 2000s, the company had spent years developing technology centered around player interaction rather than scripted set pieces or handheld engagements. With the Red Faction series exploring things like environmental destruction and player agency, while projects like The Punisher emphasized on dynamic environments and systemic gameplay over rigid encounters. Those are the kinds of experiences that gave the studio a perspective that differed from many of its competitors. Rather than asking themselves how to simply recreate Grand Theft Auto, Volition instead became interested in what they could do to contribute to the ever-so-growing sandbox genre. If Rockstar had built its reputation around creating believably cinematic worlds that just so happened to react to the player's choices on a dime, then Volition wanted to build stylish worlds that really stuck out to the player and encouraged them to express themselves through the mechanics, the customization options, and/or build a world with a big enough personality that players could get lost in it for hours if they wanted to. And that distinction would eventually become one of the most defining differences between both the two series and the two studios.